Welcome to the webinar Tracking Implementation of Building Energy Codes and Certification hosted by Copenhagen Centre on Energy Efficiency in collaboration with WRI, IEA and GBPN. This webinar is organized under the umbrella of Sustainable Energy for All Building Efficiency Accelerator as part of its thematic webinar series. We are pleased that over 160 participants have registered for this webinar and are joining us. My name is Ksenia Petrichenko and I'm a researcher at Copenhagen Centre on Energy Efficiency. C2E2 conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as energy efficiency hub for Sustainable Energy for All initiatives. Besides myself, I have several speakers contributing to this webinar today. I would like to introduce you Shannon Hisley, who is a project coordinator for the Building Efficiency Initiative at World Resource Institute. I have Peter Graham, Executive Director of Global Building Performance Network, and Brian Dean, who works in the IEA Energy Efficiency Division. And I would also like to briefly introduce you to our agenda. So we will start with an overview of Building Efficiency Accelerator and its work given by Shannon. Then I will briefly introduce the framework which C2E2 and other partners have been working on in order to help Building Efficiency Accelerator cities to track and report on their progress in energy efficiency. Then I will hand over to Peter, who will discuss different types of building codes and certification. And Brian will continue with offering the insights on the process of creating building codes. In the last part of the webinar, Peter and Brian will guide us through utilization of some online tools for tracking and reporting the progress on building codes implementation, particularly GBPN policy tools and IEA policy database. We will conclude with questions and answer session. Please feel free to post your questions anytime during the webinar using the question function on your GoToWebinar panel. It will be helpful if you indicate which speaker you would like to address your question to. I would like to draw your attention that Building Efficiency Accelerator is conducting various thematic webinars on a regular basis. All materials on the previous webinars you can find at C2E2 Knowledge Management System by following this link. And this webinar is also being recorded, and the recording and presentations will be available on our Knowledge Management System in several days after the webinar, and we will notify all the registered participants when the materials are posted. So with this brief introduction, I would like to give the floor to Shannon to give the overview of Building Efficiency Accelerator.
Hi everyone, I'm glad you could join us. As Ksenia said, I am Shannon Hisley. I'm the project coordinator for the Building Efficiency Initiative at the World Resources Institute, and I want to give a brief overview of our partnership for those of you who may not have joined us before. The Building Efficiency Accelerator, or BEA, is part of the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All platform, which has an aim of achieving universal access to sustainable energy by 2030. As part of that, one goal is to double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency worldwide by 2030. To that end, 6 sector-specific accelerators were created under the Global Energy Efficiency Accelerator platform, of which buildings is one, and the BEA partners with subnational jurisdictions worldwide to promote sustainable building policies and practices. We are currently partnered with 23 subnational jurisdictions around the world and always open to partnering with more. And the partnership itself is made up of over 30 organizations, companies, and service providers that work together to provide technical and policy solutions to partner cities. Each jurisdiction that joins the Building Efficiency Accelerator commits to implementing one enabling policy, one demonstration project, and tracking and reporting their progress on building efficiency. The model that we're working under proposes that by working with a broad range of the stakeholders involved in the governance and maintenance of buildings in urban areas, we can overcome some of the market barriers that keep us from being able to implement the energy efficiency policies that are possible given the technology that we have. Now, given the competing priorities that cities face even in the energy spectrum, why would a city want to implement building efficiency in particular? And there are many reasons. The consumption of energy is 1/3 due to buildings, and 1/4 of global GHG emissions come from the building sector. But I think more relevant to a discussion on codes is the lifespan of buildings. Constructing an inefficient building locks in high energy costs, high emissions for several decades, and represents a lost opportunity for a city to capture the economic and social and environmental benefits that energy efficient buildings can offer. So in order to help cities capture those benefits, the BEA aims to help cities through an action prioritization process to provide expertise and solutions and tools, as well as access to funding opportunities and opportunities for peer-to-peer learning and international recognition of their efforts. So to go to one specific set of tools that the BEA has been developing specifically for tracking building code implementation, we'll hand it back over to Senya.
Thank you, Shannon. Indeed, in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the work which C2E2 has been doing on tracking progress and providing guidance for the cities on tracking progress and reporting on different aspects of energy efficiency improvement across different policy areas. And this work has been structured based on the overall process which city is going through when city is joining Building Efficiency Accelerator. So there are different stages which we identified for the city in order to develop policy or project and fulfill its commitment. So starting with commitment stage, when city commits to achieve certain targets in terms of energy efficiency improvement, going to the assessment stage where the current situation in the city is reviewed based on building stock characteristics as well as existing energy efficiency policies and the policy environment and investment climate. Then the next stage is development of actual policy framework, policy packages and policy instruments. Then stage of implementation where these policy instruments are enforced, and the stage of improvement when the progress is being assessed and the decision is made whether additional efforts should be made in order to make policy development more effective. So having this process in mind, we decided to provide guidance for the cities for each of this stage in order to be able to collect relevant data, track their progress towards their targets based on certain indicators, and report back to BEA and relevant stakeholders, share their lessons learned with different cities. The tracking framework has two parts. As I mentioned, one of them is recommendations which are provided for the cities on each stage of this process and each step within the stage. It's a very simple structure, very short documents which we were aiming at not to confuse cities but really give a very clear guidance. And the other part is the reporting template, which has to be filled by the city in order to provide information and data to BEA coordinators and other stakeholders. So far, the tracking framework includes 5 policy areas or action areas. Building energy codes, which we are going to talk about today, energy performance certification of buildings, energy efficiency renovation programs, energy efficiency finance, and sustainable procurement regulations. We also provide certain recommendations cross-cutting these areas, especially on the early stages of working with cities. So let's look at some recommendations for each of the stage. As I mentioned, in this process, the first stage is actual commitment, when city commits to implement policy or policy package targeting energy efficiency in buildings. At this stage, it's very important to formulate the overall target to be achieved by this policy development process, which should be both realistic and ambitious, and set the realistic timeline for this development. On the next stage, which is assessment of the current situation, it is important to engage all relevant stakeholders in this process at this early stage of policy development, make sure that they can provide contributions to this process as well as being informed of what's happening. Here the discussion of potential policy instruments also takes place, taking into account policy priorities for the overall strategy of the city. Also, baseline assessment is very important to conduct on this stage, where the review of the status of energy efficiency in the building sector characteristics and existing policies are being made. And taking this information, it can be fed into the development of energy efficiency policy roadmap, which is actually the roadmap of what are the policy instruments or policy packages which are going to be implemented in short term, mid-term, and long term. At this step, it's also important to involve all key stakeholders and analyze preconditions for selected policy instruments in order to ensure effective implementation of policies. Selection of the policy instruments should be in line with the overall development objectives of the city. And I mentioned already the realistic timeline should be set for accomplishment of this roadmap. I showed these 5 areas of policy instruments already, and today we're going to talk only about building energy codes. For other areas, we're going to conduct more webinars in the near future, so make sure that you receive our invitations if you're interested. So for building energy codes, there are several preconditions which we outlined, and I put a couple of them here. Of course, high rates of constructions are a very good indication that it's important to have a very strong building energy code implemented to make sure that we don't lock in potential energy savings from buildings. High compliance with other regulations in general at the city level is also a good indication that building codes can be effectively enforced. Availability and affordability of energy efficient technologies and relevant capacity to implement regulations is also one of the preconditions which should be taken into account and evaluated. And of course, there should be appropriate level of awareness at the city level, starting from policymakers and ending the general public, about importance of energy efficiency improvement in buildings. So let's say the city has selected implementation of building energy code as one of the areas they would like to focus on. So at the next stage, the development of the policy, there are several steps which we identify as the important ones, starting with setting the target, ambitious and realistic for building energy performance, which buildings should achieve in compliance with the building energy code once it's implemented. The next step is actual policy design, and it's important to keep it simple to minimize administrative costs. It's good to start with targeting buildings with the largest energy saving potential, at least at the beginning, and then expand the scope further to other building types. Regular inspection mechanisms makes effectiveness of implementation of building energy codes higher, as they can show actually how buildings are complying with the regulation. And of course, if there are certain penalties for non-compliance, it should be also part of the design, as well as monitoring and evaluation strategy. It's important to think in terms of more holistic approach to policy development and understand that one policy instrument is not going to solve all the problems, so it should be actually a policy package. That's why policy support or supporting instruments to building code is also important to include at this stage. There are different types of policy instruments which can support implementation of building energy codes, and you will hear more from other speakers today. So at the next stage, when actually the implementation is happening, very often there is a national energy code and it's not implemented at the city level. So the first step would be for the city is actually to adopt building energy code which already exists. Then the next step would be to enforce it at the local level, and here it is important to collect certain data in order to ensure that buildings are complying with the regulation, and analyze and verify this data for further improvement of the building code. So once, and this kind of data can be for different indicators. Of course, it's important to track energy use of the buildings which are being built in accordance with the regulation, how much of these buildings are being built, and so on and so forth, in order to make sure that the targets which were set in the beginning are being met. So once the data on buildings compliant with building energy code is collected, this information can help to verify the effectiveness of the enforcement process. And this information can be used on the next stage when the improvement of the building code is being considered. Here are two more important steps: is to actually review this information and make the decision that maybe it's important to go back to the stage 1 and reassess the current situation and see if the situation has changed and policy priorities should be adjusted accordingly, or go back to stage 2, which is development, and use the information from the building code implementation stage in order to update and improve certain provisions of the building code in order to make it more efficient. So I'm coming to the end of my short overview of this part on tracking progress, and with this I would like to hand over to Peter, who is going to talk more about different types of building codes. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Senya. I'm just putting my screen on for you all. Thank you. Yes, well, I'd like to give you a quick overview of building types of building codes and also certification schemes to, I guess, give you a bit of a context to the discussion today. I'm going to cover 3 points. One is just putting building energy codes and certification in the context of energy savings and greenhouse gas mitigation, why we're talking about them, and then just give you a brief overview of the types of codes and compliance measures that fit with different types of codes, and then have a quick look at certification schemes and where we are with those. And then I'll pass over to Brian from the IEA to take us through more details on implementation. So to begin with, and I'd also like to mention that a lot of the information that I'm drawing on today is from the work of GBPN and partners, particularly through projects conducted under the Building Energy Efficiency Task Group of the Major Economies Forum and IPEC. So just to put building energy codes in context, building energy codes are a popular policy measure for trying to drive down energy demand in the building sector. They have been proven to be effective in the range of between 30 and 70% of improvements over time. In order to really get the best outcomes from building energy codes, they need to be part of building energy policy packages, which deal not just with setting minimum performance requirements for buildings of different types, but also set goals and targets for the industry to achieve over time. So this slide shows you a range of different measures which have been modelled by the IPCC, looking at where savings can be achieved and what the combination of savings could be if policy packages are designed well and building energy codes are put to their highest and best use as part of a framework of minimum performance requirements, incentives, and then capacity building and awareness raising. One of the most important points on this slide is the point dealing with compliance, and this is really a main challenge globally at the moment, that no matter where we are in the world, whether we're in quite advanced policy settings or in jurisdictions where policies are just being designed, compliance with enforcement and also monitoring of the actual impact of policies is still lagging behind. And so really to extract the value out of what we're talking about today, we need to be looking very carefully at how well we implement and enforce these policy measures. So just moving to the next slide. Okay, just moving on now to types of code compliance. So let's begin with what is the most common code approach, which is a prescriptive approach. A prescriptive building energy code sets specific energy performance requirements for particular elements of a building which are particularly influential in the overall building energy performance. So this typically relates to materials and components of building envelopes such as windows and insulation, but then also to the performance of more active systems, ventilation, and perhaps even standards for heating and cooling systems. So under the benefits of a prescriptive approach really are that for a building practitioner who's trying to comply with the code, basically it can be implemented in more or less as a checklist of options at the design stage, and so it is more or less the most straightforward code approach to implement. So compliance is normally checked, normally at a municipal level, looking at through the review of building design documentation. And so once the design is checked off, that it does include components which meet the minimum performance requirements of the code, then it's deemed to comply. Going beyond the actual design checking and moving into construction inspections, there's less attention paid to that checking compliance through construction, and then, as I said before, moving into do buildings actually perform according to code. That's still an area which needs development and something which certification is starting to help with in certain building types and locations. Another fairly straightforward approach is what's called a simple trade-off code. This enables you to look at overall performance values such as U value, and allows you to trade off different building elements as long as you achieve a particular performance, say insulation performance. And so this would enable you, gives the designer more flexibility in perhaps meeting budget constraints by being able to trade off less efficient materials such as, say, less efficient insulation for more efficient windows, etc. Compliance there is normally checked through, again, a building design review. There are often compliance tools which are designed to assist in allowing practitioners to make the trade-off process more streamlined. So that there are tools like Basics in Australia which provide different menu options for being able to make trade-offs, but also allow you to go back to a prescriptive approach and select specific elements in order to meet compliance. Okay, then the next level of sophistication on is really the performance-based code. The performance-based code has a number of advantages over the prescriptive and trade-off codes, because we've seen that we can really increase the level of efficiency achieved by buildings if you look at the building as a whole system. So being able to set whole building energy performance requirements, and then using simulation software to identify where a design is or is not meeting the overall building performance requirement as compared with a reference building. So it gives maximum flexibility really to the design team to be able to look at more innovative ways of achieving perhaps more ambitious building energy performance requirements. And this does really require software to enable the compliance checking to take place. At the end of the sort of menu of codes is really the outcome-based code. And this is really where we're trying to head to now. And this is looking at being able to demonstrate that the actual energy use of the building in operation meets the performance requirements of the code. There are not really any, you could say this isn't really mainstream yet, but is definitely where we need to be heading. So that leads us nicely into the question of certificates. Just before I go there, I wanted to make a couple of final points on codes. Codes are very much setting a minimum performance requirement and are considered to be necessary in order to reach the mass market, not just the top end of the town. So it's very important that code regimes are designed in a very simple manner to be able to really meet the capabilities of the construction sector, particularly small to medium companies. And there has been a tendency to perhaps try and go for best practices where the capabilities don't exist in the local market. So it's important to take a strategic approach. Energy performance certification is another policy instrument which is available to help achieve energy savings from the building sector. And we are just
Peter, I think you accidentally pressed mute, so we can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry about that. I have had a
no worries. Just go
technical issue. But anyway, so energy performance assessment certification is an area which is looking at trying to identify what the actual performance of buildings are and to provide some sort of way for the market to recognise what good practice is. There is no common definition for or terminology or methodologies for rating and certification programs around the world at this point. And you can see from this slide here that rating and certification programs are called different things in different countries. The main point, though, is that we're looking to try and demonstrate and make public the performance of the energy performance of buildings, and to use some sort of standard way to give the market a signal that certain buildings are more or less efficient. So there are 6 basic components. Although there is no common methodologies or terminology, there are 6 basic components that we can discern. And this insight comes from some great research from the IMT and GBPN for IPEC a couple of years ago. And basically what we can see is that these certification schemes are designed around 6 basic components. Quantification of energy consumption is really the first key component, and in this component we need to be considering whether or not we're going to go for quantification of energy consumption based on measured data or simulations. Both approaches are important, but oftentimes simulated quantification of energy is the first cab off the rank, because sometimes it's difficult to gain access to measured data. Simulated consumption is also referred to as calculated or asset rating, and is also used to try and create benchmarks for certain building types. And then measured energy consumption data is sort of the optimal approach. We get real operating or operational ratings, but that takes more time to implement. The second component is the energy measurement methodology itself. And in energy measurement, really what we're trying to do is to understand what system boundary we draw around the energy supply chain to the building. Is it the actual site? Is it the site plus the transmission? And do we also include any energy generated on site too. So we have most of the rating and so the certification schemes are using a total energy approach, which is the energy use on site plus some consideration of energy transmission losses. We can also look at delivered energy, which is really just what you can measure from the meters on site, and then final energy, which might be the energy use on site plus any energy produced on site. Floor area is another very important issue to consider, and rating schemes need to consider whether we're going to include just the floor area that is conditioned or cooled or heated, or we include unconditioned and conditioned space. Generally speaking, rating schemes use both conditioned and unconditioned space, even though it's not entirely accurate all the time. It catches energy that may otherwise be unaccounted for. The second key element for considering floor area is the gross floor area or the net floor area. Gross floor area is the total floor area or footprint of the building, and that's normally the one which is used. Again, it's not the most accurate, but it's actually easier to enforce, also to track and enforce using GFA. Going to building types, making distinctions between new and existing buildings. Thinking about the age of the building is very important because, first of all, talking about new or existing, obviously if it's a new building, it's not going to be consuming, it's not going to have any energy utility bills. So there needs to be some sort of definition of new versus existing. In Australia, the idea that's been implemented is that an existing building is considered to be a building that's held a certificate of occupancy for 2 years. So we're talking about a new building being anything less than 2 years old. Another consideration, particularly in Europe, is for buildings of various ages, and different countries use different approaches based on buildings of different ages. So in France, for example, different methodologies are used for buildings that are constructed before and after 1948. Comparability is another key issue. Obviously, you want to compare the energy performance of the buildings that are being certified against some sort of a benchmark to be able to determine its relative performance. So there's two basic ways this is done: an absolute comparison, which is where there is a fixed performance level, say for example 0 kilowatt hours per square meter, which is used as a reference point, and the energy performance of the buildings is compared to that absolute fixed performance level. So that's what occurs in countries like France, Germany and Denmark. There's also the relative approach, which is where the energy performance is compared against a reference building. This could be a simulated building based on code compliance. It could be a reference building built up of average consumption of a particular building type over time, or it could be other references, particularly depending on climate zone or things like that. And then finally, end uses. So what's the scope of energy which is being included in the reference, in the certification? So generally speaking, heating, ventilation and cooling, lighting, plug loads and hot water are included, but different scopes are included based on different building types. And then for more examples, we'll go through some tools later on to show you where you can find more information, but just to give you a sense of how some countries are using certification. This is an example from Australia where there is a mandatory disclosure component which links to the building code, and then also voluntary ratings, which are all based on the same rating and certification scheme, which is called NABERS. So you can see here the building types which are covered by that policy tool, and then the different end uses which are covered in terms of environmental impact, so energy, water, waste, indoor environment for offices, and then energy and water for the other building types except for data centers. So you can see that countries are starting to move towards using certification as a component of the overall building energy code compliance regime as well. So with that, I think I will now pass to Brian, who can talk more about the way these systems are implemented.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. Process of creating building energy codes is often very politically charged from both government and non-government stakeholders. However, with good planning and collaboration, we can create very effective codes. The IEA partnered with UNDP to create what we call a policy pathway. It's a book that leads you through how you should modernize building energy codes, what options there are for making building energy codes more effective in your jurisdictions. You'll see this particular snail-shaped chart is somewhat similar to what is being used for tracking the progress in the Building Efficiency Accelerator. You know, the idea of plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate. Of course, with building energy codes, the implement portion is quite sophisticated and detailed. So we've gone through and created what we call a 4-part governance, where we look at the efforts to plan and develop building energy code, the adoption and adaptation, enforcement and certification, and review and update. And why we call that the 4-part governance is because we believe that you need to have strong leadership and collaboration on each of these 4 components. And it relates directly to what Ksenia was talking about earlier, such that the left-hand side is all about the assessment, development, and improvement of building energy codes. And oftentimes, the leads on that are going to be either a national jurisdiction or some overarching body that is looking at energy efficiency across many jurisdictions. But then you'll have support stakeholders that are more locally focused. However, on the right-hand side, which is what we see as our implementation, where you're both adopting, enforcing, and verifying building energy codes, you'll see that the lead is always going to be the local jurisdiction that is actually adopting and enforcing and funding this building energy code. And with that, and with the fact that it's a continuous cycle, we ask that jurisdictions create building energy code roadmaps. And so this is an example of a roadmap that is being looked at to consider energy efficiency improvements in building energy codes in a country, looking at setting targets for various things. So in this particular case, looking at capacity building, development, adoption, enforcement, and then the review and update. And you'll see as you go through, this actually allows for all the stakeholders to come together and look at what is important, what needs to be mandatory, what can be voluntary, and that's the model code versus the stretch code, how much verification needs to be done, so how much capacity building needs to happen in the jurisdictions, and what kind of evaluation is going to go back into improving the code in a cyclical way. However, once you're at the sort of the plan and develop stage, so what we call the first step, we think it's important to look at 3 different things. One is reducing the need for energy or reducing the demand, so that is the energy sufficiency. The second is once you have these energy demands, to reduce the energy consumption associated with that, so it's improving equipment, technologies, and things like that. And then finally, after you've got your energy needs and consumption reduced as much as possible, how can we reduce the CO2 emissions, particularly as it relates to climate agreements and the need to decarbonize our society. And then once we get to the implementation stage, we have more detailed information that's inside of the policy pathway on modernizing building energy codes that takes us through compliance at both the design and construction stages, looking at how to ensure that occupancy is enabled and then once the building is actually occupied, what do you look for? And so you could say this is one level even more deep into what you need to look at in the implementation stage of the building energy code. And then finally, what we see is that these energy efficiency codes that we're creating have a significant impact on our economies. And that's really linking it back to my first statement. You know, the process of designing building energy codes is often very politically charged because it relates to a number of benefits that we have as people that are occupying and owning buildings, but it also relates to a supply chain where there's significant opportunity for selling either inefficient or efficient technologies. And likewise, in terms of the services, whether organizations that are going to be supplying, let's just say, really high energy efficient services and doing means of reducing energy use in buildings, all of these portions of our economy are affected by these policies that we're creating. So what we look for is, right at the very beginning, pulling in this four-part governance that I spoke about and making sure that all of the stakeholders are engaged early and often throughout the entire timeline of the roadmap. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Peter, and I'm going to let him talk through some of the online tools. So Peter, with that, I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so as Brian said, you know, you need to take a strategic approach, and the framework that he laid out is a common approach to setting up and then beginning to implement building energy policies. And you know, if you're starting from scratch, it might seem daunting because there could be consideration that there's a lot of information, a lot of data you've got to have your hands on in order to be effective. But I think, and also as Shannon and Xenia have pointed out, there's a lot of support available to jurisdictions who are either starting out or looking to just improve their building energy policy framework. So I'm going to take you on a quick tour of some of the policy tools which GBPN and partners have developed over the last few years to really support process of designing and implementing good building energy policies, and to give you a sense of where you can go for more support. So the approach that, that the GBPN program has been working on in supporting jurisdictions is really designing implementation of policies around three basic steps. A stock taking to find out, you know, what you have in place with respect to policies. They may not necessarily be specifically building sector related, but could be energy policies, urban planning and design policies, etc. What have you got already that could be useful? What is your building stock? Where are the opportunities for energy saving? What should you prioritize as far as minimum performance requirements for different building types and so on? And also, what's the local capabilities of the workforce? What sort of capacity building needs to take place? The second step is then developing scenarios and setting goals for building energy performance over time. This could relate to, for example, goals set under your NDCs against climate change mitigation targets. It could be domestic energy efficiency goals and so on. So working out whether or not policy measures you're implementing are going to help you achieve your goals. And finally, implementation support and capacity building. So getting the plan in place, having the plan documented properly, and making sure that it's documented in a way which enables it to be funded is important. So just on the issue of stock taking then, here's a couple of tools which are quite useful. These are all from the GBPN network partners, so there are definitely other stock taking type tools out there too, but these are just some that we have. So the first one is been produced by the Building Performance Institute Europe. It's called the data hub for the energy performance of buildings in Europe. It's about to be updated thanks to a Horizon 2020 project. I'm going to take a risk and click a hyperlink to see if I can show you what it is. So here is the BPA's data hub for Europe. It has a whole range of information, and basically it's a comprehensive stock take of building the building stock in EU member states. So you can look at building statistics for different member states, for different building types, etc. And it will give you data that you can download. So if you're in, and you can use this, you can also normalize this by climate zone. So even if you're not in Europe, you might be able to look to see whether there's anything interesting going on that might be useful to adapt in your jurisdiction. So that's one useful tool for stock taking. Another one, just on policies, is one which is GBPN produced with the Institute for Market Transformation in the USA, called buildingrating.org. And this is a database of rating and disclosure policies or certification around the world. And it gives a range of ways of looking at what's going on with certification around the world. You can use the sort of global overview to click what's going on. You can also do comparisons of different jurisdictions. So it's mainly, most of it is US-centric, but there's also some jurisdictions in other parts of the world as well. So if you wanted to compare two jurisdictions in the USA with the kinds of buildings which are affected by a disclosure policy, you can see here between the two jurisdictions how many buildings are being rated using the scheme. So that's some stock taking tools. Once you get through the stock take, you need to start to do scenario analysis and goal setting, and for that you want to know a little bit about how much energy your buildings are actually using. Some jurisdictions already have quite good databases for building energy use. However, our surveys of data availability and quality tend to suggest that it's patchy or hard to get reliable data, particularly if you're just starting out. So there are some actual sources of data around which can get you going. Ones outside the GBPN network would include the ESMAP's Trace tool from the World Bank. The IFC's Edge tool also has sort of guidance based on benchmarking data for different building types and different climate zones. So there's a range of tools. This one, the Building Energy Policy Scenario tool, is quite comprehensive in terms of its coverage of building types and climate zones and regions in the world. And you can use this to get a quick snapshot based on 3 scenarios, a sort of do-nothing scenario, a moderate policy setting scenario, and then a deep efficiency scenario. You can get readouts for comparisons of what the energy demand curves are for different regions. As you can see here, this centrally planned Asia curve gives you what happens if we could successfully implement ambitious building energy policies in that region over time, and what would happen if we did nothing or we continued with the business as usual curve. So it gives you a way of being able to quickly visualize what sort of energy savings potentials there are. You can of course do your own scenario analysis as well based on say building type. In a particular region you can pick, stick with centrally planned Asia, and then choose the scenarios that you want to compare. So you can then get a quick readout by any of these different measures. So this gives you a difference between a moderate efficiency set of policies for all buildings in this case, and then a deep efficiency. So you can see a slight difference in the predicted energy demand. You can also change the period of comparison as well, so you can actually do a time series. So rather than just in 2005, you can look at a period over time, so from say 2016 to 2050 or 2030. You can also download the data, and I think this is very useful too. So if you don't really want to worry about the scenarios which are programmed in here, you can go to a range of open link data sources for floor area, etc., for the regions that this scenario analysis covers. There's also a tool coming up, CEN is also working on with us and the United Nations Environment Programme called the Common Carbon Metric, which is going to be an MRV baseline and scenario tool for building energy-related GHG emissions. So this will give you 3 ways of being able to calculate an emissions baseline which conforms with UNFCCC climate finance requirements. So if you're looking at ways of being able to demonstrate mitigation or energy savings as a basis for applying for funding, then this is going to be an important tool that should be ready mid-year. And then finally, implementation and capacity building. There's a range of tools which are available which give you a snapshot of what best practices look like with respect to building energy codes, and then also where you can go for insight into or support into compliance and implementation. So to begin with, we have a tool which was developed in 2013-14 to identify what is a best practice building energy policy and code for new buildings, and what are the best sort of in class in the world. So what you can see here is the tool on the GBPN website, which is giving you an insight into some of the best practice building energy codes for new buildings in the world. And so first of all, at the top here, you can see the different performance criteria or best practice criteria for the codes. And these codes were scored against these criteria, not against each other, so there's no comparison between the different jurisdictions, but scored relative to their effectiveness with respect to the best practice criteria. So what can you do with this tool? So this tool will give you a quick check on different elements of code design. So for example, if you wanted to have a look at, you're thinking of introducing a zero energy target to your building codes, then you can just deselect all of the criteria and just click on the one that you want to see, and then you can go in and have a look at which jurisdictions seem to be scoring well against the zero energy target. So you go to you'll get a case study on all of that stuff. So and you can also take a look at multiple issues at the same time. So if you wanted to have a look at codes which were doing zero energy and were enforced well, you could do that. One thing I will point out, just to reinforce my point about standards in the world, when you look at that result, most of the best practice jurisdictions are giving themselves less than 5 out of 10 for enforcement at the moment. So that's the new buildings tool. Then we've got another one which is looking at renovation policies. And this tool was developed in a slightly different way, whereas the tool for new energy codes was developed using criteria developed through a Delphi approach and sort of experts scoring. This tool started in a different way. This is a comparison of renovation policy packages focusing on residential buildings in Europe and the United States. And the approach here was to have a look at jurisdictions which could demonstrate that there was a reduction in energy demand in the residential sector occurring over a period of time. And then to look into those jurisdictions and see what kinds of policy measures were involved and what were the common ones. And so then that's when we were able to draw out of that approach some best practice criteria for renovation policies focused on the residential market. So again, you can see a range of measures which are consistent among jurisdictions that are showing a reduction in energy demand from the residential sector. Having clear targets is a very important component. Having building codes require energy efficiency renovation is another important component. And then providing incentive schemes, both financial as well as fiscal. Having training and education and one-stop shops a very important aspect as well. So once again, you can go in and you can get a case study for any one of the jurisdictions if you want to dive in further. So that will help you with capacity building. The other thing that's interesting about this tool is that it enables you to compare the data that was used to develop the information. So if we compare a couple of jurisdictions, let's say California and France on, let's say, consumption per dwelling, and see what we get. We can compare the energy demand curves over a decade in those jurisdictions and see what's occurring there. So that gives you a way to support development of renovation policies, at least in the residential market. Finally is how to support the implementation of building codes. A project that we completed recently with IPEAC and Pacific Northwest National Labs in the US developed this tool, which is called the Building Energy Codes Portal. This is based on work that was conducted to identify how OECD countries principally, but also some other non-OECD countries, were implementing their building energy codes. So this is quite a detailed look at what different countries are doing to implement their codes. And so there are different ways of getting into that information. The first is by looking at the country information sheets themselves. So every country which was surveyed has its own short summary, but then it has got a long detailed description of how their codes are being implemented. And because it's quite complicated, what we've tried to do to make it easier is to break down the information in each of the country's sheets so that you can more quickly find what you're looking for. So for example, if you're looking at only looking at country in the last, let's say, the last decade, you'll get that, and then you can start to look at different issues and you can get straight to the information. Countries have used a revision site. You can look at how how many countries use working groups and how has that been done. What about surveys? How has that been done? Which it goes into quite a lot of detail about how codes are being implemented. So you can check to see which countries are using compliance checking on design, where you've got commissioning after occupancy, what sort of incentive programs are involved, and so on. So you can really get into, you can dive quite deeply into this tool. So a directory of experts. These experts have been nominated by the countries who are involved in this project, and these experts are available to contact if you're looking to get some specific question answered for implementation or compliance or other issues such as that. Is a very quick tour of the GBPN and the building implementation. So with that, I think I will be handing back to Brian to talk now about the IEA's Building Energy Codes information online.
All right, thanks, Peter. Yeah, so the IEA has a number of policy databases online where we look at the details of policies, when they were created, and you know, what countries they're currently located in, or jurisdiction level as well. The main set of policy databases you can find through iea.org/policies and measures, and in there you'll see that we have a climate change database, a renewables database, an energy efficiency database, which is more related to this call, and then finally the Building Energy Efficiency Policies database. Those two particular databases are related, but they're at different levels of detail. The Energy Efficiency database actually has you could say more high-level information on policies across all of the energy efficiency sectors. The Building Energy Efficiency Policies database is more detailed and even includes specifications inside of a building energy code or incentive or a label. And so with that, we've found that the Building Energy Efficiency Policy database has been a good way to share basic case practice, but also for us to track improvements that are happening around the world in terms of the requirements. So we actually track, what's the improvement in minimum insulation requirements by country or equipment specifications and things like that. So this level of detail in the Building Energy Efficiency Policy database enables us to do that and enables you and others to do that for your own programs and jurisdictions. The Energy Efficiency database has pretty good coverage globally. But the one thing I'll say for all of the IEA databases is we're always getting additional feedback from our country representatives, and certainly if you have any additional feedback on policies that are in your countries or jurisdictions that should be included in this database, we're happy to update it. We do update it twice a year on a more systematic basis, but we can take data at any time throughout the year. Inside of the Energy Efficiency database, you will notice that the sectors that are based on IEA's 25 energy efficiency policy recommendations, and you'll note that buildings, appliances, equipment, lighting are all related to this conversation today. So when you're doing a search in the Energy Efficiency database and you're looking for policies in various countries, you can click directly on those and find policies that could be a good inspiration for a policy in your own jurisdiction. A quick look at 5 of the energy efficiency policy recommendations for buildings. You'll notice that the first of these is the building energy codes and MEPs, or the standards themselves. And we've found that this is certainly the most important of the building energy efficiency policies. But in addition to that, having net zero energy consumption, improving the energy efficiency in existing buildings, having building energy labels or certificates, and then improving the performance of the actual building components, so the windows, the walls, the systems. So now, digging in one level deeper on the Building Energy Efficiency Policies database, this has a different set of countries that are covered that have policies in buildings, and across each of those countries, you can search for codes, incentives, and labels. And in the code side, you'll see that there's an opportunity. You can break it down whether there's a residential code, whether it's new or existing, whether it's a mandatory code, a model code, or a voluntary code, or you could just search by country. And this is an example of what you would get if you looked at Canada, and you'll see that there's a combination of both national codes and province-level codes, a combination of government and non-government labels for buildings, and an incentive program. So this is pretty typical of what you'd find in many of the countries. You'll have a combination of different types of codes, labels, and incentives. Stepping in one level deeper, here is on the left the prescriptive compliance path, and on the right information on the performance compliance path. So this is the level of detail that you can find inside of BEEP, and in this particular case you can see the insulation requirements by climate zone for various components of the building, so the prescriptive path that Peter talked about near the beginning of this webinar. And then these are broken down, if you scroll down the page, you would have insulation and then windows, and you'd have items for the systems and whether or not there's compliance checks, and all of that is located inside of BEEP. On the performance side, you'll see that there's questions about whether or not there are specific requirements in the performance path what compliance software can be used, and what end uses are considered in the energy efficiency analysis that's done for the performance path. Now, when I said that we use this information for some of our own reporting, and this is an example of a chart or a map that's been used for tracking clean energy progress globally. And we've tried to step in one level deeper instead of having a map that just looks at the national requirements, but it's to look in one level deeper at states and provinces. And you'll see, particularly in Canada, the United States, and India, that there are different jurisdictions that have the ability to require a mandatory energy code or standards. And so with that, you have different levels of adoption. But then, of course, as Peter said, you have different levels of compliance as well, which is not captured in this chart, but would be another interesting layer to add on. So with that, I think we go into the question and answer period. So I think I think Ksenia will come back on.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, we are moving into question and answer session. Just to give a quick summary of what we heard today, we heard from Shannon about work of Building Efficiency Accelerator and learned that 23 jurisdictions have joined Accelerator, and it's still open for more jurisdictions to get assistance from Building Efficiency Accelerator. And Peter gave us the overview of the context for building energy code implementation, and we learned about different types of codes and compliance, including prescriptive, simple trade-off, performance-based, and outcome-based codes, as well as basic components of certification systems. Brian introduced us to four-part governance concept on implementation and development of building codes, and emphasized the importance of stakeholder engagement and need for leadership and cooperation on each of the stages of this process. And we learned about how different analytical and online tools can help the implementation and tracking the progress of building codes development. Peter talked about a number of tools which are available on GBPN.org, as well as buildingrating.org and BPI Data Hub, and Brian guided us through IEA Energy Efficiency Policy databases. So throughout this webinar, we have been receiving different questions, and for the remaining time, I would like to ask our speakers to answer some of them. So the first question will be to Shannon. Shannon, what is the procedure for a city or organization to join the Building Efficiency Accelerator?
Thanks, Ksenia. Generally, we'll start just by having conversations with the city and city officials about their goals and priorities, and answer any questions that they have regarding being a partner to the accelerator. So you're welcome to reach out to me. You can send across your email address if you'd like, or send an email to shilsey, SHILSEY, @wri.org, or you can visit the WRI website, wri.org, and search for the Building Efficiency Accelerator, and there are a number of materials, recruitment materials, an introduction, frequently asked questions sheet, and following addressing any of your concerns and questions, then there is a BEA partnership agreement that is signed, in which the city commits to implementing one building efficiency policy, one project, and tracking their progress, and the accelerator partnership in turn commits to assisting the city in those policies and projects that they've chosen, and providing a variety of solutions and resources for the city in that process, as well as opportunities to publicize their actions and engage in peer-to-peer learning. So it's really quite a simple process. Usually there'll be a couple of phone calls with the member of the partnership, maybe an organization that's already working with the jurisdiction in question, if there's a pre-existing relationship, and then the city's mayor or equivalent executive has to sign the partnership agreement to work on those aspects over the next 18 months. So I would encourage you to look us up. All of our contact information is on the WI website, as well as the other partners here on the C2E2 website and the ICLE website, and a variety of other partners have BEA pages up on their websites with contact information.
Thank you, Shannon. The next question we have is for Peter. Peter, can you give an example of outcome-based building energy code?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very new field, as I said, but and just to give you a sense of how new it is, the International Code Council in the US last year passed an amendment to the International Green Construction Code, which provided an outcome, or does provide an outcomes-based compliance path for different building types in certain climate zones. And this is been approved in the context of pushing forwards toward absolute performance targets for buildings such as net zero energy or zero net emissions or positive energy buildings. So that's one example from the US. Another one which isn't called an outcomes-based code per se, but it requires an outcomes-based approach, or will require an outcomes-based approach, is in France. And in France, there is new building regulations coming into play, which will require all new buildings constructed from 2018 onwards to be, all public buildings from 2018 onwards to be energy positive. So in other words, be producing more energy on site from renewables than they are actually consuming the grid. And that will then extend to all new buildings after 2020. So that needs an outcomes-based code to be implemented in France. And what they've done to begin with is developed a certification scheme. So this at the moment is a voluntary program called BPOS, and this is a labelling scheme which basically certifies that buildings with this this label are producing more energy than they consume on site in a year. And there's actually a website. It's in French, but it's accessible from, if you do a search on ADEME, A-D-E-M-E, and then BPOS, B-E-P-O-S, you should be able to find it. It's look for the links to the Observatoire BPOS, and you'll get a map of 288 projects already certified under that scheme. So it is early days with outcomes-based codes, but as jurisdictions start setting absolute performance requirements, there is certainly going to be a need to bring the outcomes-based code up into more common usage. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you, Peter. The next question is for Brian. Brian, you talked about the importance of stakeholders' engagement in the process of development and implementation of building codes. So the question is, can you give an example of an effective way to engage stakeholders in design and implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a number of different ways, but I think the starting point is from the policy perspective. If you can actually create a process that enables the stakeholders to have influence, either influence through writing proposals or giving comments, or potentially even being in the decision process. I think when you start with that, that's a good place to start. Of course, what we've seen in Mexico and South Africa, we've seen holding public workshops where major stakeholders are invited like manufacturers, government organizations, the building industry itself, energy efficiency advocates. Getting all those people into one room to discuss proposals, to discuss roadmaps and targets is a good way to start. One of the most open public review process I've seen is in the United States in the International Code Council, where there's a twice-a-year meeting where anybody could submit a proposal to change any of the International Code Council codes. So in our particular case, the International Energy Conservation Code, you can provide proposals, you can stand up at a hearing and give testimony. I think these are all really good ways. It's identifying the stakeholders, putting it into your policy, and then letting those stakeholders give their say.
Thanks, Brian. And meanwhile, we just received another question for you, so maybe you can just take this one. The question is how a country can appear in the IEA database. For example, if Colombia has some data to share.
Yeah, that's great. I would love to hear from anybody. Anybody can email me at brian.dean@iea.org with any of the details of any of the energy efficiency policies and even particularly the specific buildings ones for BEEP. I believe there's also, I think it's energyefficiency@iea.org would be the more generic one, but feel free to email me directly as well.
Great. Peter, one more question to you about the tools. You mentioned a tool being developed to quantify greenhouse gas emissions reductions and energy savings alongside UNFCCC requirements for climate finance. Where more information can be found on this?
Yeah, thanks, Senya. You can have a look at, if you Google Common Carbon Metric, UNEP, there is a website which has got more information. It's the UNEP website. The tool itself, when finished, will be principally implemented through the UNEP. So that's probably the best place to get the general information. Anything specific, of course, you're very welcome to send me an email. Senya, you also know about that too, so you could, I could dob you in as well and say you could send Senya an email about the way this is intended to work. The first area that this tool will be applied in is in NAMA programs. So the Common Carbon Metric will be deployed in Southeast Asia to begin with Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines to help support their NAMA program applications.
Thanks, Peter. And perhaps the last question for both of you, Peter and Brian, it's about application of building codes to different climate zones with a particular focus on extreme hot and extreme cold areas. Is there some considerations which has to be taken into account in order to implement building codes in a more efficient manner?
I'll start off on this, Brian. I think what we've actually found is that most of the cold, extreme cold climates are many of the leaders in building energy efficiency codes because it's almost survival that you need some basic energy efficiency to have basic comfort. However, to go beyond that, certainly what we like to see is if there's prescriptive code, we like to see an analysis that identifies what cost-effective levels over the life cycle of the building can be used in terms of insulation and windows and getting to that energy sufficiency side, and then of course identifying on top of that what levels of cost-effective heating equipment in particular can be added on. Peter, do you have anything to add on to that?
I think that's a good answer. I just a couple of other points. One, I think, as you just highlighted, taking into consideration the passive measures to avoid heat loss is super important, and then also looking at what kind of influence you can have on the efficiency of heating equipment is really another important element to sort of break down to two basic things. The third thing that you need to consider is what is your building type. What are the main building types that need to be covered by a building energy code in those extreme climates, and what's the fuel type which is really predominating. And to give you sort of some examples, the approach that's taken in northern China to deal with the heating demand in winter and in an efficient manner is very different to the approach that's taken in, say, very northern Europe, in the Nordic countries, because the form of building is completely different. And in heating zones in northern China, there needs to be some consideration of district scale efficiencies as well. So looking at how you could supply energy efficient heating, district heating is key. And then on the cooling front, if you're in an extreme hot climate, then the fuel type shifts perhaps more predominantly towards electricity. And so there you need to perhaps be thinking about not only the passive measures, natural ventilation and shading, and perhaps vernacular approaches as well, perhaps including thermal mass and so on, which sometimes don't get included in codes, because codes can be quite prescriptive with relation to equipment. Then thinking through what kind of opportunities you've got to incorporate renewable energy and sort of photovoltaic electricity supply to offset any sort of heavy emissions loads from electricity demand. So I guess that a couple of more contextual issues, Brian, but there you go.
Thank you, Peter and Brian. I know I promised that was the last question, but we got one very interesting one. This is about including existing buildings into building code. So from your experience, how many building codes cover existing buildings, how important it is, and what should be the process of including this part into the building regulation if it's not yet implemented?
I'll start off on this one again as well and let Peter add on. Existing buildings are, well, there's two different sides of it. Major renovations on existing buildings are typically well covered in building energy codes. However, minor renovations in existing buildings or encouraging people to do energy renovations on existing buildings is commonly not regulated. And however, it's incredibly important because the majority of the energy use is in existing buildings, and that really the renovation rate is really our biggest challenge in terms of achieving the 2-degree scenario for climate change. So oftentimes what we see is that there are incentive programs or tax programs like Germany and France have been very successful at that encourage the renovation of existing buildings. However, it has been very hard to require an action that wouldn't otherwise have been done. So if somebody wasn't planning on doing a renovation, it's been very challenging from a policy perspective to require that. Peter?
Yeah, I think there's another issue too, and that is that building energy codes, they cover building work. So in essence, the renovation should comply with the building energy performance requirements for whatever they are. But when we look at this issue from the point of view of what level of renovation is required to reduce energy demand in line with keeping climate global warming below 2 degrees, we know that we have to vastly increase the level of energy efficiency gained when buildings are renovated, and also increase the rate of renovation as well. So there is certainly a regulatory path which needs to be designed into a policy framework. The incentives, as Brian mentioned, are also really critical. But I think also more broadly, and we're starting to see this in in Europe, for example, they're looking at how you can start to industrialize certain renovation techniques. So, we're starting to see prefabricated external insulation products coming onto the market in some countries in Europe, which enable deep renovation of residential buildings to happen rapidly. So there's a scale issue as well. And then I think also the trigger for getting investment into renovation is really an important policy consideration. So what kinds, and this is again circling back to one of the reasons for having certification schemes, is to try and identify the value add of energy improvements. And another element, just in terms of producing demand, is not trying to sell renovation as an energy efficiency renovation, but rather, if you look at single-family homes, if you are clever about the way you market remodeling kitchens and bathrooms, you'll achieve quite a bit in terms of savings in for example, hot water usage, energy related to that, and then heating and cooling and comfort issues as well. So it's a bit more complicated than just having it in the building code. I think there needs to be certainly the policy package element of this is really important, and the GBPN tools sort of point that out, that there's a far more complex and diverse set of policies which are at play in the jurisdictions which are actually being more effective in reducing energy demand from their existing building stock.
Thank you, Peter. This is a definitely great conclusion of this webinar, the importance of policy package. And as I said, we are going to have more webinars on other components of policy packages on energy efficiency in buildings. And with this, I would like to thank our speakers for great insights and presentations, and of course all the participants who stayed with us throughout the webinar and asked great questions. So thank you very much, and once again all materials will be available on C2E2 Knowledge Management System. You can check it out. We have more information resources beyond webinars. So thank you very much, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Senya. Bye.